Speaker, Dr. Frank Van Diggelen. He's a distinguished engineer at Google and a member of NASA's GPS Advisory Board. He holds over 100 U.S. patents for GPS and is a pioneer of assisted GPS, the technique that allows GPS to work in cell phones, so pretty important. He is the author of 2 GPS textbooks and teaches GPS, including the online course from Stanford University and Coursera, which is available on YouTube. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Van Diggelen.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Library Foundation for inviting me to speak tonight, especially Nancy Middleton. I'm very honored to be here. Hello, and thank you all for coming out on a cold winter night. GPS contains great science, bitter rivalries, and geopolitical intrigue. Tonight, I'll take you on a guided tour of its history, science, and technology. I'll tell you about the fascinating backstory of the birth of GPS, as well as about the underlying science, including relativity. Yes, I hope to exercise all our brains here tonight. I'll cover some of the most interesting and unexpected uses of GPS. I'll tell you some tricks to make GPS work better for you. And I'll end with a glimpse of the future. This should take about 40 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So please save your questions for the end. The Global Positioning System, GPS, from the United States and various copies from Europe, Russia, China, India, and Japan comprise a total of more than 130 satellites. They orbit tens of thousands of miles above us and transmit a signal with less power than a small light bulb. Yet these signals are used for navigation in 7 billion smartphones and millions of watches, cars, boats, and aircraft. Scientists use them to study their environment, to measure gradual tectonic plate shifts and sudden changes from earthquakes. Surveyors use them for centimeter-accurate location, as do farmers and construction crews, steering and controlling heavy machinery using these whispered signals from space. They also provide the most accurate time available to us, used to synchronize the electrical grid and our stock transactions. GPS was conceived in the 60s, developed and built through the 70s and 80s, and used worldwide from the 90s. So far, it is America's last great gift to humankind. Before GPS, the US Navy built the first satellite navigation system. It was called Transit. It could locate ships to a fraction of a mile and was used worldwide. The US Air Force envisioned a system that could locate planes and bombs in 3 dimensions to a few meters of accuracy. And so they set out to build their own system. The critical design was created in 1964 by James Woodford and Hideyoshi Nakamura. The key distinction from the Navy system is that the GPS design envisioned atomic clocks in space and works by measuring the difference in time from when the signal leaves the satellite to when it arrives at you. Using this time difference multiplied by the speed of light, you have a distance from each satellite. If you're this far from this satellite, and that far from that satellite, and so on, the computer inside your GPS receiver can work out where you are in 3 dimensions. Indeed, in 4 dimensions, because inside the mathematics, time and space are intimately connected quantities. So by considering the problem in all its dimensions, Woodford and Nakamura freed navigation from the 2-dimensional shell it had occupied and made it universal. To make this work accurately, you need these very precise atomic clocks in the satellites, all synchronized to within a few nanoseconds. That is a few billionths of a second. At the time of this proposal, no one had successfully flown or operated an atomic clock in space, so this was an audacious plan. In fact, today you may be thinking, what the heck is an atomic clock anyway? Right? Well, every clock has something that changes periodically. A sundial works because the Earth rotates regularly. A grandfather clock works because it has a pendulum that swings regularly. And an atomic clock works by exciting electrons in an atom, and the electrons resonate at a characteristic frequency, kind of like a tuning fork. You take a tuning fork like this, you hit it against something. Don't know if you can hear that, but that's 440 hertz or 440 cycles per second that the tuning fork resonates at. You hit a cesium atom with a laser, and the electrons will generate a wave at that frequency. In fact, this is the official definition of a second, is the amount of time it takes the electron from a cesium-133 atom to emit this many waves. So, to build, well, before I get on to building, I should mention we should call these clocks electron clocks because of the way they work. That would be more correct and not sound like an atomic bomb or atomic energy, which is a completely different thing. But we are stuck with the phrase atomic clock. So to build a cesium atomic clock, you make a vacuum tube, you have some atoms of cesium in the vacuum, you shine a laser at them, and this excites the electrons, and they emit waves at this particular frequency. You have some circuitry to count the waves, just like the grandfather clock counts the swings of the pendulum, and that is what is inside each GPS satellite. Actually, 3 of them inside each satellite for redundancy. And at the heart of each of these clocks is a vacuum tube that looks like this. And this is an actual atomic clock vacuum tube being built. This went into one of the GPS satellites. As you can see, is manufactured by hand. This person's holding this blowtorch. This is something that a glass blower from 3,000 years ago would instantly recognize. And it's at the heart of every atomic clock and every GPS satellite today. I think that's pretty cool. Meanwhile, the Navy Research Lab had also experimented with accurate clocks in space as far back as 1964. Initially, these were quartz clocks, not atomic clocks. And when the Navy did experiment with atomic clocks years later, they never had much success. Still, there has been some dispute about priority when it comes to invention of GPS. But it is the Air Force design and system that triumphed and that we all use today. And the Navy transit system was completely obsoleted by GPS in the 1990s. The GPS system succeeded thanks to the Air Force program leader, Colonel Brad Parkinson, now deservedly known as the father of GPS. He is still very much alive, a personal friend who lives just down the road in San Luis Obispo. So armed with the Woodford-Nakamura proposal, Parkinson requested funding for a GPS pilot program in 1973 and failed. The Pentagon refused to fund it. After revising the proposal with more focus on benefits to the Army and the Navy, the program was approved at the second attempt in December 1973. So this period between failure and success is a key chapter in the legendary backstory of GPS. Like any good startup story, there was a long weekend when 10 officer engineers, completed the revised proposal, working 3 days and nights over the Labor Day weekend in the otherwise deserted Pentagon. There's a documentary on YouTube called GPS, The Lonely Halls Meeting, that provides great detail about this. But there were more funding hurdles 5 years later, in 1978, with 6 satellites already in orbit and successful tests showing it worked as intended, the Air Force decided to stop further funding. They relented after a design modification to add a nuclear detonation detection system to the satellites. So if someone explodes a nuclear weapon, the GPS system will detect and locate it. So GPS was obviously a military system. Parkinson had a sign above his desk that said, "The mission of this program office is to drop 5 bombs in the same hole, and don't you forget it." But it was always intended to include a civilian component. From the beginning, it had an open signal on one frequency and an encrypted military signal on another frequency. However, the open civilian signal worked much better than expected. And so the US Air Force added deliberate errors up to 100 meters. Meanwhile, the US Coast Guard wanted mariners to have accuracy better than 10 meters. And so they worked out the errors and broadcast corrections for them. So companies could and did build GPS receivers that canceled the Air Force errors with the Coast Guard corrections. Your tax dollars at work. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the Clinton administration stopped this deliberate degradation of GPS, unleashing a wave of low-cost receivers that we used in our cars long before the first smartphones. You may have had one of these. See, I also have artifacts. A TomTom or Garmin device. And it still works. And so where do you think the administration made this momentous announcement that changed GPS forever? At the Pentagon? Or from the White House? Or in Silicon Valley? Or Wall Street? Does anybody know? They announced it in Edinburgh, Scotland. And why there? Because of more intrigue, this time involving America's adversaries and allies. The one strategic intent of GPS was to create a system that the whole world depended on. In the 1990s, I attended a public talk at a GPS conference where a US Air Force officer showed photographs of a Russian fighter plane and a Chinese rocket launcher, both outfitted with commercial GPS receivers from the United States. And he said, quote, "One day there will be a generation of adversaries who only know how to navigate with GPS, and that's just fine with us," end quote. So remember that the publicly available signal is on a different frequency from the encrypted military signal. So the US military could jam that one frequency in a conflict zone, and only the US and NATO forces would be left with unjammed GPS. However, despite NATO access to the encrypted GPS, there were generals in Europe who wanted their own system. So they would have independence from the US. But why should the European taxpayer pay good money for a system that the US is providing free? Well, one of the arguments was the European system will be 10 times more accurate, because ours was degraded to 100 meters. So when the US took away this motivation for a European system by removing the deliberate degradation, they announced it not in the US, but by sending the head of NASA to a European satellite navigation conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. So in the end, of course, the benefits of national autonomy and control won out, and today there are GPS-like systems operated by Russia, the EU, China, Japan, and India. And your smartphone can use most or all of these systems simultaneously, and this national competition is a great boon to you and consumers worldwide, because the more signals you have, the more accurate and reliable the location in your phone. Here is a snapshot of the GPS and other navigation satellites tracked by my phone. You can see from the flags, each of these is a satellite. There's American, European, Russian, and Chinese satellites that is tracking, all at the same time. I took these screenshots for you while I was visiting the National Observatory in Greenwich, England. You see the longitude of 0 east there? So this was a pilgrimage for a navigation nerd like me, and I thought it was poetic to capture screenshots for you there. But I had to be outside the US in any case in order to see all these satellites, because the FCC controls what you may listen to on the airwaves in the US, including signals from space. And you may not receive signals from, quote, non-US licensed space stations. This is enforced in software by phone manufacturers in the US. So you will only see a subset of all these navigation satellites on your phone when you're inside the US. So does this mean GPS on your phone works better when you're outside the US? Yes. So by the time GPS reached your cell phone, it had already been through the birth struggles of Air Force versus Navy, deliberate degradation, Air Force versus Coast Guard, US versus its allies, and finally the FCC versus you. Yet despite all this, I'm happy to say that the science of GPS far, far outshines the politics. Remember I told you that GPS is based on atomic clocks accurate to nanoseconds? Well, GPS satellites travel through space at a speed of about 7,000 miles per hour. At that speed, time itself slows down by a measurable amount, according to Einstein's theory of special relativity. Also, the GPS satellites are 20,000 kilometers above the Earth, where gravity is much less, and this speeds up time, according to Einstein's general relativity. Together, special and general relativity predict that time is different at GPS satellites by almost 39 microseconds per day when compared to time on Earth. This is a huge amount in the context of GPS. If you make a 39 microsecond error in the measurement of a GPS signal, you get a 7-mile error. So obviously, this has to be and is accounted for. All those GPS atomic clocks are set to be slower by 39 microseconds per day before they are launched, so they operate at the correct speed once in orbit. And that's not all. That 39 microseconds per day is just the primary adjustment made to the satellites. There's a secondary adjustment you are all carrying around in your pockets. The orbit of a GPS satellite is slightly elliptical, so it gets a little bit closer and moves faster, and then further and slower as it goes around its orbit. And this affects time. And these changes have to be adjusted for continually. And so that's done inside the GPS receiver, like any GPS receiver, like the one in your phone, in a line of code like this. This single line of code combines the discoveries of three of the greatest scientists of the last 500 years. Johannes Kepler, who worked out the orbits of the planets around the sun. In fact, you see his name there in this method of where the code is working out the ellipse of the orbit. Isaac Newton, who showed that it is gravity that makes the planets follow these orbits, and thus applies to any orbiting body, such as a GPS satellite. And Albert Einstein, who discovered the connections between time, speed, and gravity. So all three of these are combined in this single line of code, which is the secondary relativistic adjustment for time experienced by the satellite at each particular part of its orbit. So every time you use your GPS, this line of code is executed, and you have completed a successful experiment validating the theory of relativity. So that is super cool, in my opinion. But there's something wrong with this picture. Our American GPS system depends on 2 Germans and 1 Englishman. But luckily, we have a key American scientist in the backstory of GPS. Dr. Gladys West, the child of sharecroppers in Virginia, is a mathematician who worked for the US Navy and accurately computed the shape of the Earth. So wait, isn't the Earth a sphere? You may be thinking. Well, kind of, but it's an uneven sphere, firstly. And secondly, while the Earth started off quite spherical, as it got older, like many of us, got shorter and fatter. The polite term for this is oblateness. This uneven shape and the oblateness of the Earth were accurately computed by Dr. West and are critical in the orbit computations for GPS satellites and appear right here in the GPS specification. There you go. So science is obviously at the heart of GPS, and also a result of GPS. The first really interesting use of science in GPS is geophysics. Geophysicists measure tectonic plate shifts by using fixed-site GPS stations like this one. They can measure the relative position of one of these to another one to better than 1 centimeter. Thus, with a whole network of these, they measure tectonic plate shifts all over the world. You can go to this site, unavco.org, there, and view movement of the Earth anywhere in the Earth, for example here. And what you'll see is that in Carmel, we are moving about 2 inches per year. Now, luckily, you don't notice this because the entire coastal area of California is moving the same way. But it's kind of interesting. And the same network of GPS station measures sudden shifts caused by earthquakes. This slide shows the data from the Tohoku earthquake of 2011. This is the one near the Fukushima power plant in Japan. So what each of these colored lines shows is the displacement experienced by one of those stations. Each colored line is one of those stations I just showed you. And any wiggle on the line, a wiggle of that size, is 1 centimeter. And so these are several centimeters of wiggle. And the earthquake began in Tohoku and then spread all around the world at a rate of about 2 degrees per minute. So after 36 minutes, arrived at Stanford, where one of those stations is, and half a minute later arrived in Carmel and moved us by a few centimeters, and then continued to propagate all the way around the world. So about 2 hours later, came back again, and then again, and then again. So wherever you were on Earth, you were moved by this earthquake, literally, whether you felt it or not. And we know that because of GPS. Now, it's not just scientists who use GPS to centimeter accuracy. Farmers are unlikely trailblazers of precision GPS applications. They use the same technique as the geophysicist, measuring the position of one station with respect to another. But in their case, they have one fixed station and one on the farm machinery. And so they can automatically and precisely apply seeds, fertilizer, etc., in varying amounts as needed. And so this reduces their costs, increases their yield, and reduces runoffs to waterways. 30 years ago, in 1995, I worked for a company that made precision GPS receivers. They sent me to an agricultural trade show in Iowa to see if there was any interest from farmers. So at first glance, this was like the kind of tech trade show I was used to, at 10 by 12-foot booths. My colleagues and I were showing off our hardware. But right next to us was a guy selling a better kind of manure. Anyway, there was definitely some bemused interest from the farmers. A farmer came up and talked to me and said, how accurate is this? I said, 2 centimeters. He said, what's a centimeter? Today, 30 years later, that farmer and his peers can tell you all about precision GPS. And there's an entire industry known as precision farming that's worth over $10 billion per year. Alongside the farmers, construction workers have adopted this technology. In road construction, for example, graders now automatically follow a digital design to cut and fill the surface of a new road to match a profile that's entered into a computer in advance. The GPS antennas sit right there on the blade. You can see it there. Sits right on top of the blade, and another one on the other side, so they can program in camber and automatically grade that as they move. And of course, land surveyors use the same technology. Anytime you see someone with a pole or a tripod with something that looks like a frisbee or a dish on top, that's a precision GPS receiver. Some of you may recognize the surveyor on the right. She is in the audience with us tonight. It's my dear wife, Allison. If you enjoy any of this talk, please thank her afterwards for her many hours of listening to and editing the rough early versions. So let's return to scientific applications of GPS. There are many, many uses that are surprising and quite amazing. I'll give you just a couple of examples so you get a feel for the vastness of creativity that GPS supports. There's a discipline known as remote sensing, where radio signals are used to measure and monitor the Earth's environment, something becoming more and more important. GPS signals reflect off the ground or water or ice, etc., and the characteristics of the surface that it's reflecting off can be measured by collecting and analyzing the signal. So in this case, and most commonly by another satellite, such as that one there. So this sounds almost like magic, but here is just a partial list of things that are measured like this. Ocean wave heights, ocean winds, river and lake surface slopes and width, floods, snow and ice cover, glacier surface structures, soil moisture, and atmospheric water content. A more obvious scientific use of GPS is animal tracking, and all kinds of animals are tracked by GPS, from elephants to migratory birds, and ocean animals as well. The leading lab in the world is right here in Monterey, next to the aquarium, the Hopkins Marine Lab. It's run by Professor Barbara Block of Stanford. And the purpose of tracking animals is primarily to protect them, in particular by understanding where they are and where protection zones should be. So this is data from a study from Professor Block of where and how big marine protection areas should be for certain species. So also there's this pure scientific purpose of understanding our environment and the animals we share it with, and this yields all kind of interesting data, such as what you see here. So for example, the bottom plots show the tracks of specific animals by species. And so there's the white sharks. So now it's long been known that the white sharks really like to hang out at Anua Nuevo and Farallones, because that's where the most, and presumably most tasty, seals are. But where do they go the rest of the time? Well, now we know that they really like to go here, this area that's become known as the White Shark Cafe. You see down there. There's an area very rich in sea life. That's what the dark colors are showing up there. And like any decent cafe, it now has its own website. It's like, so it's just off if you're from San Diego, a few hundred miles offshore, you'll get there. So you're okay on the beach. Also, though, what we see from the tracks is that the white sharks, when they're not at the cafe, they like to make visits to Hawaii, just like us. And that's Hawaii right there. So now at this point, some of you are thinking, who's tracking me with GPS? The answer is very likely nobody, unless you are deliberately sharing your location with someone through an app. First thing to realize is that the GPS system itself cannot track you. It is a one-way transmit-only system, like an old-style radio station. Remember when we listened to FM transistor radio? Maybe some of you still do. If so, kudos to you. The radio station doesn't know when you switch on or off your receiver. And GPS is the same. It transmits, and your GPS receiver listens. And the GPS receiver works out where you are. the GPS satellites and systems itself have no way of knowing if you're even listening, let alone where you are. The only things the satellites can detect are signals sent up to them from the GPS master control station and the X-rays, gamma rays, electromagnetic pulse, and optical flash emitted by a nuclear blast. And then they can accurately locate the source. So don't detonate any nuclear weapons. Now let's talk about the location apps. There are many apps designed to track you. For example, Uber or Lyft, where a feature of the app is that the driver can find you and vice versa. So in these cases, you are sharing your location, and you're doing it through your cell phone. Cell phone is both a receiver and a transmitter, of course, and it can send data to someone else. But what about the police? Can they use a GPS tracker to track you? Well, that's exactly what these fellas are discussing. We know this is what they were discussing because the Supreme Court told us so in 2012. The police, using a GPS tracker that had been covertly placed on his car, had successfully convicted Antoine Jones, of drug dealing. And so the appeal in the US versus Jones case reached the Supreme Court, who decided that a GPS tracker used by the state without a warrant violates the Fourth Amendment, which says you are secure against unreasonable searches in your person, houses, papers, and effects. So the police need a warrant before placing a tracker on your car. Companies, however, can and do track their own vehicles. So these devices have become popular with truckers who want to borrow the truck for a private delivery or an unofficial detour. These euphemistically called personal privacy devices transmit a radio signal. As you can see, it's a little gadget that you plug into the cigarette lighter adapter, and it transmits a radio signal illegally at the GPS frequency. And this jams GPS satellite signals for anyone nearby, including the truck itself. Including, in 2012, a GPS reference station that formed part of an automatic landing system at Newark Airport, which is right next to the New Jersey Turnpike. So, and I just heard from Tim here, who's a pilot, a similar thing has apparently happened in an airport in Michigan on a bridge that fly over just before coming into land. So this is illegal. These jammers are illegal, but you can easily find them online, as you see. Protect your vehicle from being tracked. Oh, yeah, well, there's a premium because they're illegal, so I guess they're taking some risk. So please don't buy one. They're illegal to use. They endanger other people. And the person who jammed the Newark airport ended up with a $42,000 fine. So that's good. But if truckers can jam GPS, so can nation states, and with much stronger, more damaging signals. And this has been happening repeatedly in the war in Ukraine. One of the obvious reasons is to disrupt the enemy's drones, missiles, and anything else guided by GPS, because they can now drop 5 bombs in the same hole. Another surprising issue arose in Ukraine. The Ukrainians were using the Starlink for communications, and a Starlink device uses GPS to know where it is so that it knows exactly when the satellites are passing directly overhead. So the Russians were jamming GPS to disrupt the Ukrainian Starlink communication system. Then the Ukrainians found they could dig a hole just a few feet deep, put the Starlink antenna in there. It could still see the Starlink satellites and communicate, but it was protected from the jamming signals that swept over the top of the hole. So with such combinations of space-age electronics and shovels, we fight modern electronic warfare. Now, spoofing is a different kind of malicious GPS disruption that uses a replica, fake GPS signal. By setting the signal a little stronger than the real signal, you can fool a GPS receiver into tracking it and thinking it is wherever you want it to be. The plot of the 1997 James Bond movie, Tomorrow Never Dies, includes a GPS spoofing attack by the Bond villain misdirecting a British warship into Chinese territorial waters. So James Bond movies are often ahead of their times. But in real life, in Red Square in Moscow, the Russian government constantly spoofs GPS signals. If you use a GPS receiver there, it will show your position as in the nearby Vnukovo airport, southwest of Moscow. So why do they do this? It's because all commercial drones include databases of all the airports. And so if a commercial drone finds itself near an airport, it will automatically land. So you cannot fly a drone at Red Square or anywhere near the Kremlin, which is right next to Red Square. So unfortunately, examples like this of jamming and spoofing are multiplying. In northern Israel, the Israeli government has set up GPS spoofers to protect them from drone and missile attacks. In Seoul, Korea, there are regular jamming and spoofing attacks from across the nearby border with North Korea. And on the coast of the Black Sea, where Vladimir Putin has his dacha or holiday house, there's constant GPS spoofing. Now, the trouble with each of these is that once a government invests in such a system, they tend to keep using it. And we see a ratcheting of instances of deliberate interference. So expect to hear more of this kind of thing in years to come. Now, remember, right back at the beginning, I explained how GPS depends on super accurate atomic clocks. So apart from accurate position, GPS is constantly providing you with incredibly accurate time. There are many applications where GPS receivers are used only for providing time. The two most interesting ones are the electrical grid and stock exchanges, power and money. Electrical grids need accurate timing to synchronize the phase of different power stations when bringing a station online. And this is accomplished using microsecond accurate time from a GPS receiver. And in stock exchanges, accurate timing is needed to correctly place orders, especially important with electronic exchanges and high-frequency trading, which is now common. The SEC requires exchanges maintain an order trail with trade times stamped to 50 millisecond accuracy, which is modest accuracy. But for high-frequency trading, trades are executed in a fraction of a millisecond, and this is managed by GPS-based clocks. So I was thinking about this. One lunchtime, I asked a GPS colleague, how come someone hasn't spoofed GPS near a stock exchange to move time backwards a few milliseconds? Then they can buy a stock from the past when they know the current price is already higher, then sell it immediately for an immediate and guaranteed profit. And they said, how do you know they haven't? So I don't know enough about the nuances of high-frequency trading to know if that is a feasible conspiracy theory, but it's at least a plot for a movie in case you're working on one. Now, I want to leave you tonight with some helpful knowledge to make GPS in your phone work better for you. But first, our last piece of history for the night. How did GPS get into your cell phones in the first place? This is a story where the FCC plays the unusual role of the hero. The first 911 call was in 1968. All we had then was landlines, and they were linked to addresses, and the 911 dispatchers sent the responders to the address of the landline. Then as mobile phones became popular, dispatching the 911 responders became a problem. So in 1999, the FCC required that wireless carriers provide the location of a cell phone along with any 911 call. And they could do this using location from the cell tower itself or from GPS. And believe it or not, GPS was considered a long shot back then because the chips were quite big and power hungry and the signals were too weak to work properly inside the phone. A dozen startups sprouted to make better GPS, two succeeded, and by the mid-2000s, GPS was the standard way to locate a 911 call. So two big things enabled this. Firstly, Moore's law. Chips got 2 times smaller every 2 years and 2 times less power hungry. Today, the size of the GPS in your phone is approximately 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. Second thing was signal processing innovations made GPS receivers 1,000 times more sensitive, so they work perfectly well in the phone, despite the very weak signals from space. So GPS found its way into cell phones just in time for the arrival of the smartphone. And who made the first smartphone with GPS in it? Apple. And for bonus points, when? And what was the operating system? Okay, the answer is Hewlett Packard in 2005, and this is the phone. The HP iPac 6900. You didn't see that coming, did you, right? And the operating system, Microsoft Windows Mobile. So as you see, it's like a little BlackBerry. It had TomTom maps in it. We don't see these anymore. But in 2007, the first iPhone was released, and it did not have GPS. The second model of iPhone in 2008 included GPS, and after that, every smartphone you've ever heard of. So now here are the tricks to make your phone's GPS work better. The very first smartphone designers rapidly added inertial sensors so your screen knows when it's in portrait or landscape. And they added electronic gyroscope sensors so you can play games. And the phone can sense very small rotations. So these sensors are also really good for supplementing GPS location when you're driving, because the sensors can sense if the car is accelerating or turning or standing still. And software is built into the phone, so it knows if you're holding it in your hand or if it's attached to the car. When its sensors is attached to the car, we'll make use of those sensors to supplement the GPS, and it really makes a big difference. So to make your GPS work better, use a dashboard mount. Stick it up there on the dashboard. Okay. So now, especially for Carmelites, how do you help your friends find your house? Okay. So open Google Maps on your phone. Just zoom into your house. I've zoomed into the Sunset Center here. And let's suppose we want our friend to come to the parking lot out front. So you just press and hold in that spot there. And a little pin will appear. And then you can click the share icon, which is that thing over there. This down the bottom. That's the share icon. So there's the pin. You click on that share icon, and it will offer you every possible way of sharing through email, WhatsApp, messages, whatever. And then you can share that pin, and the person just navigates to it. So do we still need house numbers? Yes, we do. Because one of the problems with our quaint lack of numbers is you can't prove you have a resident when trying to do things online. So for example, suppose you want to open a bank account online. You will encounter the dreaded address line box. And no matter what you enter, when you live within the Carmel-by-the-Sea boundaries, the website will not accept it. Okay, this also happens with airline websites, government websites, PG&E, and many, many more. And why? Because the websites like these, they use address database matching using the USPS address management system. And you must have an address that conforms to the standard protocol with 5 things: zip code, state, city, street, and number. You have to have those 5 things, and the address has to be in the database. Otherwise, you'll get this. And this only going to get worse as websites add automation and reduce human customer service. So what's needed to fix this? 2 things. Assign numbers, add them to the database. This does not require physical numbers on your house or the street or anywhere else. We're just talking about what's inside the computers so we can all function online in the 21st century. So let's get back to improving GPS on your phone. If you're traveling anywhere, you can download Google Maps in advance so you can continue to get direction when you're out of cell coverage. So this will happen to you anytime you go down Big Sur. And if you're traveling abroad, you won't run up large network charges when roaming with your phone in another country. So here's how you do it. You click on your icon on the top right. There'll be a little picture of you or some avatar. Then, so this is in Google Maps. You click on your icon in the top right. Then you click on the thing that says Offline Maps. And there, then you click Select Your Own Map. And then you zoom in and out or pan to the map you want. And you click the Download button. And that's it. Now the map is in your phone, and you don't need the internet to continue navigating in that region. Okay. So what's next for GPS? Space. This diagram shows how GPS is already used in space and how it will be used. So low Earth orbit, LEO, is where satellites like Starlink live, also the International Space Station, spy satellites, weather satellites, the remote sensing satellites I showed you before, and any satellite you can see with your naked eye. Geostationary Earth orbit, up here, is where the TV satellites live, like DirecTV, etc. And GPS is in between them. There. So the low Earth orbit satellites are below GPS, and they routinely use GPS for position. Geostationary satellites are nominally above GPS, but as you can see, the beam from GPS overlaps the edge of the Earth, and so geostationary satellites on the other side of the Earth can use GPS satellites and GPS-like satellites from the other countries to compute their position. And so this is something new that's happening. And so now NASA is looking at using GPS on the moon in a very similar way. In fact, the first spacecraft to carry a GPS receiver to the moon was launched just last month and is now orbiting the moon. So here is some fresh video I received on Valentine's Day. This was taken on 14th of February. It's from the lunar lander as it approached the moon and then entered lunar orbit, where it is now. So these are real pictures from this satellite. And This spacecraft is scheduled to land in 11 days on Sunday, March 2nd. I hope you'll see some good news about it. The lander is called Blue Ghost, and it's manufactured by a US company called Firefly. So if you hear those names, this is what they're talking about. All going well, this will be the first GPS receiver on the moon. Now, GPS signal is weak to start with, and even weaker by the time it reaches the moon, but is the same high-sensitivity signal processing technology that made GPS work in your phone that is now being used to make it work on the moon. And when you're at the moon, all the GPS satellites will appear in the same part of the sky. I don't know if you noticed this. You see this thing that looks like a new moon? That's all of us. That's the Earth. So all the satellites are going to be coming from there, and so that's very bad for accuracy. You prefer to have satellites all around you. And so what they're planning for a few years to come is to add a few satellites in orbit around the moon and then use those plus the ones from the Earth as the lunar positioning system. And in future, we can expect a Martian-based system as well with satellites orbiting Mars. And then what? Well, a long time from now, when our descendants travel beyond the solar system, they will make use of a natural GPS system that exists out there. A pulsar is a special kind of star that provides extremely regular pulses of radiation. When a star, like the sun, reaches the end of its life, it explodes and then collapses into something called a neutron star, just 20 kilometers across, very dense. And these neutron stars rotate extremely rapidly and generate regular pulses of radiation that you can detect and measure, like an atomic clock. They're like natural GPS clocks in far outer space. And just like with GPS, we can measure the arrival time and one day use these as a great natural GPS system to provide location for voyages beyond the solar system and between the stars. So you can see that the ideas of Woodford and Nakamura from the 1960s have proved remarkably enduring, and one day will take us almost to infinity and beyond. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, and while we do questions, I'm just going to leave up this list of reading and viewing for you. There are many books on GPS you can find online. These are my favorite few that I have in my own personal library and that I put up here as recommendations for you.
If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. I'll come to you with the mic. So.
Thank you. Very interesting. How many satellites are up there circling the Earth, and how many does the United States have, and what country has the most?
Oh, great question. Thank you. So of all the satellites, not just GPS, there's about 11,000. It's growing very rapidly because a lot of communication satellites are going up. The most numerous is from Starlink, which is a United States company. So the United States has by far the most. About 8,000 of those 11,000 are in low Earth orbit and used for things like communications and for photography, right? Like weather satellites and so on. So yeah, 11,000 total. 80% of them are American.
Hold on one second.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
I do recall the Navy transit system way back. I share your opinion. It was god-awful. The gang I saw were from the Applied Physics Lab at Hopkins, who I think had the Navy contract. I was on a ship where they were trying to use it. And the more I looked at it, the messier it got. It did not work well. The story I was interested in was the HP introduction. I know Dave was always very proud of Hewlett Packard's creation of atomic clocks. He loved to talk about it. Were they HP clocks in the first satellites?
No, they were not.
Okay.
There were some German clocks, actually. There were some German guys who sort of specialized in that and came out and worked. I don't think they worked for HP, but then HP did make atomic clocks later, and it was an offshoot of HP that pioneered the construction part in that photograph of the construction machine came from Trimble Navigation, from a friend of mine at Trimble, and that was an offshoot of HP. So HP, although they're not in the phones, GPS phones, they're by far the leader in the industrial side of GPS.
The satellites, I think, have 2 cesiums and a rubidium in each one.
Yeah, most of them do. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Does black holes, or do black holes play any role in this whole system?
No,
or
not
will
yet.
they?
The neutron star, by the way, is like the last stop. If a star continues collapsing, it'll become a black hole. So neutron star is what happens to the star when it gets that far and then stabilizes out. But so yeah, so far, so 1,000 years from now, when we're out there in space, the signal from a neutron star, you'd have to account for the lensing effect that'll happen as it passes a black hole. But none of us will be around to see that, unfortunately.
I'm a little nervous about the spoofing GPS and wondering how we're fighting against that spoofing.
Right.
What are we doing about that?
A great question, and then Tim asked me before as well, the jamming as well, which is a lot easier. So the spoofing is spectacular because it actually fools your GPS and puts you somewhere else. So in northern Israel, what's happening now, so people call an Uber and they see their position. So by the way, they also spoof to an airport. They spoof to the Beirut airport. So so everyone thinks they're in Beirut, and so what they do is so the way they operate, people getting out paper maps, and they call the Uber and say, I'm standing here at this address. And okay, so what are we doing about it? Well, so there's a new generation of GPS satellites that has a new frequency, a new signal on a frequency that's a little bit better protected, and the design of the signal makes it more robust, so it's harder to spoof. And then for aircraft especially, I know we have some pilots here, there's a thing called a phased array antenna that can point a beam in a certain direction. So you have many antennas, and they connected electronically, and you can generate a beam that picks up signals in a certain direction, and you can steer that beam, and you can create nulls in certain directions. Unfortunately, from 1950 to 2025, these were regulated under something called ITAR, which is regulations in the US that control things like missiles and critical technology. In the 1950s, this was critical technology that the US had, and people, including this advisory board I'm on, have been lobbying for years to get this taken off because everyone knows about this now. There's no point keeping it secret anymore. There's Canadian companies building these things. There's a Turkish company that's in the lead in this, and we're out of the game because our own rules stop us from manufacturing this and exporting this until 3 weeks ago when finally it succeeded and it was taken off the ITAR list. And so so commercial aircraft could now put these on. I mean, of course, now it's going to take time to catch up, but you can make the beam point upwards. The good thing about all the jamming and spoofing is coming from the ground, so you can make aircraft a lot safer by using these phased array antennas. No. Yes, taken us only 75 years to get it off the 1950s critical technology list, and but that's one of the paths forward for things like aircraft. Yeah.
Oh, I have a question. Hi, Frank. I'm Julie. Thank you.
Julie.
A few years ago, I saw a documentary about Heddy Lamar and her contributions to the tracking technology. What do you know about that? And
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. There's this. I could stay here till tomorrow, telling you things that I think are really cool, and I had to kind of trim it down. I had to leave Heddy Lamar out. So Heddy Lamar was an actress, and in World War II, she and a friend who was a piano player, I don't know the exact how they came to be doing technical things or for the government. She had some relationship with the government, and they came up with the idea for radio communications where you would send a signal in one frequency and then have it hop to another frequency and hop to another frequency. And they demonstrated this by using a mechanical piano that could play. So it would go, okay, this note, this note, this note, and you put one at each end, and you use that to coordinate it. And so at this end you transmit, and it's jumping around in frequencies, and at that end you jump around at the same rate. And now that's not exactly what's done now, but a thing that's kind of mathematically the same is done in GPS, and it's called code division multiple access, or CDMA. And so your cell phones use this. All your conversations on LTE and 5G use this. And what we do is you spread the signal across many frequencies at the same time and then recombine it at the other end. So if one or other frequency gets interfered with, it only messes a little bit, and you still get the bulk of the signal back. So we're doing something that really was inspired by Heddy Lamar back in World War II, which is a cool story. So thank you for bringing that up.
Anybody else? I guess one last question, I think. Actually saw a couple last questions.
Thank you. So we've all been stuck on planes in bad weather and got frustrated with the time it takes to land. Mm-hmm. Is it true that the Europeans use GPS in their air traffic control and the US doesn't? And if that's true, is that just because we haven't invested in the infrastructure?
So not quite true. So we do use, so in recent years, so planes used to just fly point to point. They'd kind of go straight and turn. You probably could feel it sometimes, right? You're going straight, you're on your way to Europe, and the plane's going straight, and suddenly it turns because it flew over a beacon, and it gets a new direction. So with GPS now, US planes and European planes can follow their own routes, and so this saves thousands of tons of fuel a day, probably. And you might notice that where before you'd come into San Francisco Airport and you'd always go join the queue way down at 101 and fly up past San Jose and then over the bay. Like planes are starting to do shortcuts and stuff like that. So they are using GPS more and more throughout the world for plane routing.
We still have to use the figure 8 to get our accuracy better?
Okay, let me explain to everyone. So if you do this to a phone, the magnetic compass that is in there, which is a very, very... I didn't even mention the magnetic compass when I talked about making work better in the cars. All phones have a magnetic compass in there. And it's very simple, cheap magnetic compass. Not nearly as good as the kind of thing you buy for hiking, like the silver compasses that you buy at REI. It's a tiny little cheap compass. And they get uncalibrated, and if you do this movement, it makes it more calibrated. And in fact, in Google Maps, they used to prompt you to do this, and then they did a study, and they found people really don't like doing this. They feel very stupid. And so we just try not to use the magnetic compass very much. So when I mentioned that when you mount your phone in the car, what it'll use is the accelerometers and the rate gyro, which tells you your rate of turn. And so now when you're walking, when you're walking, if you're using GPS, it'll make use of that compass to give you an initial heading. So that'll help a little bit if you're walking. If you're in the car, don't worry about that. Just mount it up. And if you don't, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned, if you don't have even if you put it in the cup holder, as long as it's stationary with respect to the car, it'll work it out for itself because it knows from the GPS where it's moving, and it can sense how the car's moving. If it sees they're going in the same direction, it can obviously tell the difference between that and in your hand. It'll engage those sensors. So there you go. Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for providing such an interesting history of GPS and for sufficiently blowing our minds with the future of GPS. We are going to be thinking about this, I think, for many weeks to come. And I just want to say thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
That was a great talk. And also, if you want to mark your calendars, March 26th, we have a fireside chat at the library that is public discourse. So please come for a conversation. It is going to be about media ethics and dialogue across the boundaries with Professor Dr. Patrick Bélanger. And we'd love to see you at the library for that. Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and thank you again.